So discipline is really about choosing which priorities matter to us, and then also turning those priorities into a must. Powerful life lessons that I learned from a billionaire, both spiritual and practical. So diving in, the very first one I learned is that perception is a story. Our viewpoint on anything in our life is a story that we're telling ourselves, but also is very limited by only our perception, by our perspective, by the knowledge that we have about the situation, as well as the story we might create about the story and what we believe to be true about it. You know, if you have a conversation with somebody else and they provide more knowledge, more perspectives, and I believe that all of our perspectives create what's known as capital T truth. But you see, when we have one perception about something, then it builds up into a story and it becomes a very limited view that we have. A teacher I had in elementary school, that I viewed him as kind of a hard butt, as somebody that was very hard, tough to deal with, and seemed like he really didn't like kids, that he was very angry at kids all the time. This was a PE teacher, and he seemed that no matter what activity we were doing, he just seemed like he was always mad at us, always grumpy at us. So my story was that he hates kids. He hates his job. He hates kids. This was elementary school. So from kindergarten to 6th grade, I dealt with this guy. And I just thought that he hated kids. And from my perspective he's a very angry person. Found out later on in my high school years when I chose to go into driver's ed, and in that driver's ed class, I ran into this same teacher again. I didn't know that he taught driver's ed on the side. I didn't know that, where I grew up in Missouri, driver's ed was a summer course. I ended up having him as the exact same instructor again in driver's ed. He was my direct instructor and teacher. There was someone that taught the class, but then there was other teachers that got in the car with you individually and taught you to drive. And we began to drive around and spend a lot of time in the car. As we drove, he gave directions, he taught, but there was such a differentness to him. There was something different about him. He was oddly different and gentle with teaching me how to stay straight on the road and use turn signals appropriately. And he was very kind about teaching me each and every rule of the road. He didn't yell at us once. He didn't get mad at us once. And so finally, one day as I'm talking to him more and more, and we're coming to the end of these 3 months together, and he's doing the final test, which is essentially the exact same test that you go off on the driver's test with. As we're out about driving it, I simply just blurt out, I thought you hated kids. And I'm surprised that you volunteered to deal with teenagers. But I thought you hated kids based on how you trained us, how you taught us in elementary school. And he divulged that actually specifically during that time, is that he himself had a very strict elementary PE teacher and was going through a divorce at the time in his life. And so he was kind of hitting this zone of not knowing how to act as a teacher. And so he relied on what he remembered from a kid. And when he was a kid, that would have placed him 30 years previously to how I was. I grew up in the 90s and he was acting like a PE teacher from the 70s. Now there's nothing wrong with the 70s, there's nothing wrong with the 90s, but those are two very different worlds, and things happened very differently. Things that were okay even in the 90s for teachers to do and parents to do and adults to say are not okay today, with certain regulations and ways and things that we've learned that lead to trauma, that lead to things. So a lot of his teachings was him just falling back on what he had seen as a kid, because he was going through a divorce. He was going through a really rough time in his life, had lost confidence in himself, and just didn't believe in himself. Now, yes, I was with this guy for 6 years in elementary school, but during that time, he was beginning to have troubles with his wife. And then they fell into separation, and then they got divorced. And so by the time I was leaving elementary school, he was in the midst of that divorce, in the midst of his depression. And I can even look back and realize, as he told me that when I was in kindergarten and first grade dealing with him, I didn't see him as such of a hard ass. Didn't see him as somebody that was mean and hated kids all the time. But I did by the time I was in sixth grade. So, but knowing his perspective knowing what was going on with him allowed me to understand, yeah, he was a grumpy person. Yes, he did have issues going on, but he didn't hate kids. He wasn't trying to make our life miserable. He wasn't just yelling at us to yell at us. He was yelling at us in a way because that's how he was taught and wanted to strive and push us towards greatness. But I would never know that without his perspective. I held a grudge towards this man, and I did for a long time until that day, until that final test. Even the 3 months we spent together, it began to soften my heart and open me up to actually speak. Now, as a teenager, it took me a while to ask those questions. As an adult, it's something I would ask right away. It's something I would get into right away, especially as a life coach. It's something I'd be like, hey, what was this all about? What's going on with that? But that's the lesson that I learned from this billionaire in my mid-20s. In my mid-20s, I was offered this beautiful job to work alongside a billionaire who helped multiple companies go to $1 million a year, and as well as was running a program that was designed for people to step into being their best versions of themselves. The program helping us to break down our walls and belief systems and step into that. That was his way of giving back to the community. And that's how I met this billionaire, who eventually he asked me to run those trainings for him and to facilitate them. He trained me in them, but I also got to learn a lot about business walking beside him. So these things that I'm going to share with you are lessons that I learned from this man that are both practical, that we can apply to our practical lives to make a difference, as well as they have a spiritual meaning behind them. They have a mindfulness power behind them that shifts everything. Now, I use the example of the story because that's who I was as a kid. That's how things were and flowing. And that's an example of how my story was very limited in its perspective. I couldn't see other possibilities. I couldn't see another side of the story. So you can look at yourself in your life and what story are you telling yourself about an experience, about a relationship, about someone in your life, or even just a story about yourself that you are having a limited perspective about, that you could ask the harder questions of, well, what is their perspective? And maybe even zoom out, maybe, kind of zoom out to a bird's eye view, or take yourself so personally out of it and see and try to understand someone else's perspective and see if that can't resolve some of the issues with that story or open you to a greater version of it. You can even do this on the flip side of things you really enjoyed, things that you like about yourself, and ask, why do I like that about myself? Where does that come from? Where does these characteristics that I enjoy about myself, how did I form them, and why are they important to me? Another thing that I learned from this gentleman, discipline is choosing priorities. And so discipline is really about choosing which priorities matter to us, and then also turning those priorities into a must. And by a must, I mean these are not things that we say, oh, I should do this, I have to do this, or I'm going to do this is a little bit better, but it's changing into I must do this. And why must you do it? Because it matters to you. This isn't a forceful must of like, you must clean your room, you must brush your teeth. Those are habits that we were probably told by our parents, but these were habits instilled by our parents that had a different kind of level of must over it. In today's world, and as an adult, yeah, I brush my teeth because I don't want cavities. I don't want to have issues in my mouth. So this isn't that kind of must of you have to do it. It's a shifting things that you say I have to maybe I get to, and then taking it deeper into I must do these things because of who I am aiming to be. These priorities matter to me because of who I'm aiming to be. As an example, if you're working a 9-to-5 job or a job out there for some corporation that you may not enjoy, it may feel like you have to go to work. But if you realize, well, I want to have money to provide for my bills, I want to have a savings, I want to have a healthy retirement, as well as even maybe I want to save up and then have a career shift, you can change that into I must do these things in order to make my life better, in order to improve myself, in order to make these priorities mean something to me of a great importance, to make them matter to us in our life. That is how you shift it into a must, so that the drive forward, the push forward, maybe even the pressure you give yourself is because the priority that you want to accomplish means more to you than the priority of not doing it. Whenever we say yes to something, it is kind of an exchange of our energy going out. Whenever we say no to something, we're putting that energy into us. But asking, why am I saying yes to this? Why am I saying no to this? Why am I in resistance to it? Or why do I view this as something that I have to do or I should do? End all the shoulding all over your life and shift it into, I must do these things, but make sure that they're musts of a high priority that you want to engage in, that you actually desire, and they fill your heart, or they excite you, or the end result gives you energy. Like working out, for an example, I love the way I feel after I work out. I don't mind the muscle tension and the burning sensation in the muscles because I feel more alive. I feel healthier. I feel greater. It's the same reason I choose to eat healthy food and avoid sodas and so forth, is because if I put my life into the zone of I must eat healthy, I feel better, because feeling better, having more energy is a high priority for me.